The special population I'll be discussing is substance use problems and how that pertains to health social work. Working with persons with substance use disorders strikes me as different from working with other populations in two primary ways. One would be the extremely high rate of comorbid conditions that must be considered when creating a treatment plan. Some of these in the physical sphere include hepatitis and liver diseases, gastrointestinal issues, tuberculosis, pneumonia, sexually transmitted infections, kidney failure and kidney disease, cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis, severe chronic pain, genitourinary conditions, musculoskeletal conditions, fibromyalgia, immunodeficiency syndrome, cancer, neurological conditions, respiratory problems, dermatological concerns, and dental problems. Comorbid mental health conditions are also extraordinarily prevalent amongst persons with substance use disorders, including anxiety disorders, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorders, psychosis, and problems with overall physical, social, and emotional functioning, including a much higher risk of suicide than the general population. Another significant difference in working with this population is the high likelihood that the client is using more than one substance, thus creating a high degree of complexity and changing the nature of pursuing effective interventions. For example, the use of more than one non-opioid substance together with an illicit opioid is extremely high. Some of the most common substances to be used with illicit opioids include nicotine, marijuana, alcohol, muscle relaxants, crystal meth. This showed an 85% increase from 19.6% to 36.4% over the course of the study. Crack cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl. One study showed this likelihood at 95.8% in the first analysis period and 96.4% in the final. Of note, as Arminda pointed out in week 5, the DSM-5 does not address polysubstance dependence as its own disorder, so it becomes even more important to be watchful for signs and symptoms like high tolerance, withdrawal, physical signs of use, risky behaviors, and many others. Two main challenges of working with this population. The first is the high rate of stigma and associated blame, and the broken relationships that come with that. Persons with substance use disorders often demonstrate destructive behaviors as a result of either use of the substance itself, for example, violent outbursts, withdrawal from society, and unpredictability, or the need for procuring the substance, for example, stealing, taking advantage of people, damaging relationships with people who will not enable the substance use. Because of these disturbing and destructive behaviors, persons with substance use disorders are often blamed for their own condition. This is unique to this population, as if someone presented with, say, breast cancer, for example, they would likely be met with kindness and concern, and would certainly not be blamed for their diagnosis. Whereas if a patient presents with a heroin addiction or alcoholism, the perception might likely be that they've done this to themselves. As a result, isolation and lack of support networks often figure highly into the lives of this population. As Arminda pointed out in week 5, physicians and resource providers are not immune to these prejudices, and the labeling of patients can lead providers to fail to offer appropriate interventions and instead negatively judge the client based upon their behavior. Substance use often also negatively impacts financial resources, and many people with substance use problems find themselves in extreme poverty. The social determinants of health affected by this poverty include things like food scarcity, lack of access to transportation, unstable housing, and severe risks to personal safety. As a social worker, there are two main areas of preparation that I would use. First and foremost, research. It is absolutely imperative that a social worker be informed and up to date on the conditions, trends, signs and symptoms, treatments that affect the population they serve, as well as the resources available to their clients and the requirements and nuances around obtaining these. That part is particularly important, as referring someone to an agency or service for which they do not qualify can break trust, disrupt the motivation and change cycles, and even trigger relapse. The second is networking and connection. It is not enough to merely know what resources are out there. The social worker must also create relationship with interdisciplinary teams and providers of services in order to be an effective connector of client with services and creator of a comprehensive treatment plan that will truly support the client. The social worker's needed resources include possession of an up-to-date toolbox, providing thorough understanding of what resources are available, the people with whom one can interact to procure services, and the requirements, qualifiers, and limitations around each. And again, I cannot stress enough the importance of relationships. Creating strong relationships with providers of resources and services, from physicians and their support staff to county workers and food pantry workers, from shelter heads to subsidized housing agencies. Relationships can open far more doors for the client than knowledge alone ever could. Some of the resources that may support clients with substance use problems include inpatient and outpatient recovery services, behavioral health providers, primary care physicians, specialists, food banks, transportation vendors, housing providers, law enforcement, and even child protective services. In addition to simply providing excellent, empathetic care to one's clients and allowing one's work to speak for itself, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, the primary way a social worker can distinguish themselves from others working with these clients and patients is networking and building of relationships. A certain degree of confidence is needed to put oneself out there, but it is well worth the effort to connect with other social workers and resource providers and establish oneself as the subject matter expert, or at very least, a competent and trusted partner in the shared care of our clients. So my question to you would be, what could a social worker do on a macro level to positively affect societal stigma against persons with substance use problems? Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for listening.